Okay, it's 2 minutes after the hour. We're going to go ahead and kick it off here. The session is being recorded. A little bit of housekeeping there. The session is being recorded, so if you manage to miss some of the items in the session, or you wanted to review them, you'll be able to go back and watch the recording. It also makes it easy to share afterwards. So if you saw something interesting and you wanted to talk about it with your colleagues or peers, thankfully, InfoOnline is making the link shareable, which is fantastic. So thanks to Alia for letting me have some time here. And I hope that your takeaways from this session will be meaningful. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'm happy to stay on we'll do some 5 minutes Q&A at the end. I'm happy to stay on and answer some questions there. If I don't manage to get to your questions, then we can answer them. I can follow up afterwards and answer them afterwards. So right off the top, I want to simply note that this session is about software. You guys saw the software title, Library Software and Innovation Navigating Future with EBSCO. But EBSCO certainly does a lot more than software. You might be familiar with EBSCO because of a lot of our content services, our serial services, but we do a ton of software. And the software isn't just necessarily about knowledge bases or linking services and discovery. We have long managed those services and have some industry-leading services in that regard, particularly around e-resources, knowledge bases, linking, discovery, and access. But we have more services that are newer to the library services landscape. And those are what I'm going to principally cover today. Really some of the innovative pieces that we have built in the last couple of years, and even some future direction state in which direction of travel EBSCO is going in, and how that may impact libraries across multiple verticals. It doesn't matter, you may be coming into an Alia online session and you may be working at an academic library. You could be working at a public library, a health library system. These are all great. I hope today you'll see stuff that is meaningful for all of those verticals. But the takeaway here will be really focused around 3 specific innovative areas that I'm hoping will be very important. And I believe they'll be very important to the industry at large as we move, say, in the next 10 years of systems, services, descriptive work around bibliographic records, and more access and more. Okay, so with that said, right off the top, just some agenda. We are going to go through these services in some slides. At the very end of the session, I'll have some time for some Q&A. And if there is a ton of time at the end, I'm even happy to jump into some live demo if we have time for that. So right off the top, a non-product specific message for everybody, in that there is going to be some changes in how patrons will be able to get access to e-resources. The browser service providers, looking like 2024, the browser service providers are going to be launching new privacy measures, whether you're in Chromium-based browser, so not just Chrome, but say Edge. If you're in Firefox, if you're in Safari, if you're in these other browsers, they're all moving away from being able to have IP embeds inside of URL strings or within session information, rather, and moving away from that into FedCM, the credential management services, the federated credential management services. So what this means for libraries is this means if you are using a proxy service that relies on IP, this embedded IP, you're going to need to look at how does the browser change impact patron access to my e-resources. If you are an Open Athens library, you don't need to worry about this. Not only is Open Athens supporting non-proxy access, so they support SAML as well as proxy. So if a move away from proxy at a browser level wouldn't impact Open Athens libraries, But in addition to that, Open Athens is also part of the FedCM discussion and the seamless access discussion. So Open Athens and EBSCO have members of the board discussing this, on the seamless access board, discussing this and the impacts for libraries. So we are really trying to make sure that EBSCO customers, Open Athens customers, libraries of all shapes and sizes won't lose access to electronic resources. If you are on proxy, particularly like an on-prem proxy, you're likely to be impacted. So I would heavily advocate that you reach out to an EBSCO personnel that you may have, an Open Athens personnel, somebody that you know around your authentication routines, to see what the impact might be as we get closer towards 2024. If you're thinking about Open Athens now as a service, you've already been in this discussion, the implementation times are around 12 weeks or so. It can be up to 16 weeks, depending upon how many publishers we need to work with in your profile. So plan ahead, right? Get ahead of it. If there's going to be a lot of libraries that need to make a switch over from proxy into SAML services or into something that supports FedCM, then you don't want to, be caught off guard. You want to be ahead of it. So just a heads up for everybody. There's going to be a move away from having IP in-session information in browsers. Okay. So with that, I want to jump into something that I think is really cool and a holistic narrative, pathway narrative forward in libraries as a whole around how libraries do bibliographic descriptive work. If you've been familiar at all with linked data, then a lot of the discussions around Bibliograph will resonate with you. Bibliograph is a service that EBSCO has that is built on linked data. If you've been looking at other areas around RDA toolkits and the way that libraries can do bibliographic description work, then I would suspect that linked data is going to be something that sounds really interesting to you. So hopefully you'll get a good takeaway from this session. Okay, so what I mean with bibliographic description work and Bibliograph as a whole with linked data is that libraries have been describing bibliographic records in many flavors of MARC, whether using MARC CM, MARC XML, a MODS or METS schema. Maybe you're a library that's supporting CN MARC or CAT-P in Japan. These descriptive schemas have long kept the bibliographic information isolated to the catalog. If you were to take a MARC record out in any one of those schemas, take a MARC record out of an ILS, and you were to try to give that record to another service, whether that's an IT service in your IT department, and try to get them to read that, or try to pass information to, say, even Google. Do you want to do an export into a Google Scholar, for instance? In the schema, the default schema of MARC or MARC XML, those systems, those modern technology platforms generally can't make much use of the record. Will it pull a little bit of information out of there? Sometimes not. But it doesn't really make use of those records in a way that would allow patrons to search for and then obviously find access. Some of the fields may have URLs, essentially for like ebooks, if there's an e-resource pointer. But for a lot of the physical works, in particular, there's no identifying fields within there unless you're doing a lot of deep cataloging. So this has left library collections siloed. And we do a lot of work, catalogers, we do a lot of work around bibliographic description that then doesn't get necessarily leveraged or used as much as it should. So one of the ways that we want to extract that data is we want to get that data into modern search services so that patrons who don't come to the library website at all, but go to an open web tool, may be able to still find collections in the library, right? We know that even if you think about yourself, your own morning routines, did you already go to Google once today? Perhaps. I've been to Google several times today. For me, it's afternoon, so it's easy for me on a daily basis to get into Google and do some general queries. Some of that might be, hey, I need a book for a project I'm working on, or I'm looking for some readings from my students, as they come into the classroom next week. So I want to find something ahead of time, whatever that is. So I want to be using open web services and get library collections to those open web discovery points. Transforming the MARC catalog record from MARC using Bibliograph, EBSCO service Bibliograph, transforms it into BIBFRAME, a BIBFRAME schema. This BIBFRAME schema is linked data. So what is linked data at a very high level? If you're not familiar with the term, linked data is the ability to create connection points across not just what's in that record, but as that record has correspondence to other similar points of data outside of the record. So here's a great analogy. You go to a party and everybody at the party has a name tag, but the name tag doesn't really tell us how you know other people at the party or how they might know somebody else within the party that you are familiar with. So if I create instead a name tag that shows relationships of not just myself, but of you that came to the party and everyone else that came to the party, it would be able to create connection points to let me understand, oh, in this case, Tom is a brother of Jane, and Jane is the best friend of Mia, and now I understand Mia's relationship to Tom. So this type of connected landscape allows me to better understand the players of data elements in this context. Now, if I do this in a graph, in an open web linked data graph, now I can create connections beyond just about Jane and Tom and Mia, but elements about the events that they went to, where it was, when it took place, and location perhaps. All of those elements now come into this larger picture about the party as a whole. So think about this in the context of a bibliographic record. I could have a topic, in this case, Einstein, Albert Einstein. And I know there are elements about Albert Einstein individually as an author, where he's from, the works that he's done, the subject disciplines, his expertise. I would know other things such as age or his works, his scholarly works that he's published, maybe even things that he hasn't necessarily published, but papers that he authored or co-authored. I would know a lot of information because Albert Einstein is a known figure and there's a lot of different data points across him topically. And the more relationships we can make across the data, then the more powerful and usable that data becomes. It's no longer locked in a silo like your catalog records, right? We're creating these connection points, expanding that narrative. So I want to look at a real example. On the left is a MARC record. This MARC record is Albert Einstein, The World as I See It. And I'm going to map this record. I'm going to use Bibliograph. I'm going to transform this MARC record into BibFrame. Bibliograph, the product from EBSCO, transforms MARC records to BibFrame. That's what we're seeing here on the left, transforming data elements from different fields of the schema into BibFrame functional areas. So creator, subject areas, summary, works, LC numbers, etc. Now this information is in a graph, and the underpinnings of Bibliograph, the product, maintain URLs and UUIDs. Those are unique identifiers for each of the different data elements of this record. So you can see a contributor or a creator, descriptions, and all of these things have unique URLs and UUIDs. This means that across the graph, they can all come back to a pointer. So if I now might be in another catalog's record, another library's record. And they're getting information from the graph because they're also connected to BibliGraph. They can leverage this URL to identify which library this record came from and information about this person as a creator with this UUID. These URLs allow us to have data points across the graph in all areas of a schema to better enrich the bibliographic descriptive work around Einstein and the world as I see it in this case. Now, what we also do is we take those library catalog records. We don't just transform them and put them on a graph. We do that, but that's not only what we do. We take those bibliographic records, we transform them to BibFrame, we put them into a graph of linked data. But now we also map that graph to other authority sources of records and similarly pull in data from those authority services to enrich the library's catalog records. So in this case, we can enrich Albert Einstein with different variants of spelling, different VIAF identifiers, or maybe perhaps even URIs or DOIs of his works. Anything that's maintained in the Library of Congress under Albert Einstein, I would be able to pull into the graph and map to my collection. But we don't just use the Library of Congress. We can use many different authority services, including AATSIS, that's the Aboriginal and Indigenous Australians of Torres Strait Islanders service. We use AATSIS metadata for the graph. We also use services like ORCID. So if you are an academic institution and you're interested in ORCID data in your library catalog records, BibliGraph would be able to leverage ORCID data. We leverage lots of different authority services data. There's a large list that's public, and those different authority services now come in and make the catalog records not only more robust, but also more leverageable when I want to use the BibliGraph graph for some tooling around my library. I'm going to show you the tooling. Okay, so it sounds really good, but I want to see that tooling. I want to see how we can leverage it. First things first, all of that data in the graph is sent to other graphs elsewhere, in particular, the Google Knowledge Graph. So if I am now in Google and I've never visited the library, but I have a particular title I want to search for, I can go to Google, I can use Google Books, and I could try to search for a library near me without having to necessarily buy a book, because a lot of times Google Books will recommend Amazon or they'll recommend some other purchase routine. But Google can also look by geo-IP. When that user comes in on their mobile device, it will say, hey, you're near this area, and did you want to look at a local library near me? Now, Google Books actually does a little bit more than that too, in that I could pin or save a library. So if I know that my university is always University of Melbourne, I can pin University of Melbourne in my profile of Google. And that way, every time I come in to a Google book page, there will always be a University of Melbourne if that title is in University of Melbourne's collection. Now, if it's not in University of Melbourne's collection, I would still get other libraries geo-IP'd if they also had their records in the graph. Remember, the Google Knowledge Graph doesn't know how to index MARC records. Google Knowledge Graph is getting collection records from many different services, and one of which is EBSCO's BibliGraph linked data graph. So this allows patrons to find your library's collections by never visiting the library and just going to Google and saying, hey, look, if the library is using BibliGraph, I can see that this book is on the shelf. Let me call up the library. Let me place a hold. Let me make sure I know that I can come in and get it. It's worth noting, really quick before I move on, there's actually a video that will be coming out here in the next week or so of Willara Public Library. They have been using BibliGraph for about 10 or 11 months now, and they have gotten a huge uptick in library catalog usage and patrons going to Google, finding items from Google, and then calling the library and just saying, hey, I'm going to come in and check it out. Can you put off the side for me? So There's going to be a video that's going to come out this week, I think, actually. Pretty nice. Other things that you can do instead of just going to, say, Google, is that you can use really easy embed tools to embed subject-specific or item-specific, so maybe author, creator-specific tools. You can embed carousels, these carousels, wherever the library has impact. So in this case, over here at Bayside Public, they've got a lot of different catalog areas that they highlight. In this case, this happens to be a kids catalog section where we've got some cooking books for kids, crafts for kids, drawing for kids. These carousels are not manually maintained. They are automatically updated every time the library catalogs a new record, or maybe they have some deletes and they get rid of some other records, no longer having some of the books perhaps. Every time they maintain their catalog, when they change collections, those are automatically updated to the bibliograph graph. Once the graph is updated, then these embeds are also updated with the right titles. Now, the same is true for what's sent to Google as well. Those are all automatically updated every time the library catalog data refreshes in the graph. Then there'll be all of these downstream services that are connected to the graph will also be updated. Now, over here on the right, this is actually a LibGuide page. So this isn't an academic, this is the European Parliament. And you can see that they have an embed here on 2 different subject areas, so artificial intelligence and ethics. And they put up titles in their collection on these subject areas. Now, I actually think this is pretty unique in that they can identify different subject topics by using the subject fields within the bibliographic record, and then mapping those 2 different collections together in the linked data graph to find everything that is related to artificial intelligence and ethics, and then give me all of the items in a list and put it into this carousel. Again, all automatic. The ability to create these is very easy. The ability to create lists is very easy. And then share and publish these anywhere the library has the ability to do so. So perhaps a faculty page, maybe you want to highlight some authors' works. You would go into Bibliograph, you would find the author, and you would look for all of their works and then create a carousel of their works. Or maybe you want to add it to faculty reading pages. So maybe subject specific, where you might have all of the faculty in a specific discipline, maybe biology, for instance, and you want to highlight all of the author works for all of the faculty in biology. You can easily come up with these carousels and embed them across different library pages. Now, the last kind of what do we do with it once it's transformed into linked data is the ability to do collection analysis so that you can either add more titles to a collection, or maybe you want to compare with a peer on a collection. And not only at, say, institutional levels, like what you're seeing here, University of Melbourne is comparing their items within the topic area of decolonization. They're comparing their collection with University of East Anglia. But what you could also do in this vein is you could look up a specific subject area and you could find titles where you want more collections in the certain subject area. And they want to add these, you can see the ISBNs in this. You want to add these items to your procurement. These are items you want to go out and purchase to make that subject area more robust. So you could get an extract of these and then load these into a procurement platform, Gobi, Rialto, whatever that might be. So I want to go ahead and I want to promote the ability to do collection development, either by certain identifiers like a subject field, or by an author, or by doing institutional comparisons. The linked data graph allows me to compare collections across institutions as long as the institutions are using the linked data graph and across these multiple discipline areas. Very easy tool to use and very robust data because of all the data on the graph. Okay. Moving out of Bibliograph, I want to move into FOLIO. And you probably have heard of FOLIO, but there's actually a connection I'm going to talk about in a little bit with the linked data piece. So we just covered linked data. I think it's really important. Directionally, this is where library cataloging will be moving, is towards linked data. That doesn't necessarily mean that MARC and MARC descriptive work is dead or dying. That's not the case. We're going to be using MARC for a long time. But the future direction is really towards more open and robust bibliographic description, which is in linked data. Okay, so let's talk about FOLIO, and then we'll kind of dovetail back to how that relates to linked data in a minute. So if you're unaware, FOLIO is an open source ILS, or an open source LSP, library services platform, integrated library service platform. It would be what you would have to manage the collection of the library, manage users and your ability to check items in, check items out, do some acquisitions workflows, et cetera, et cetera. There's a difference here, though, in that while it is one, it's open source. That means right away you're only in a comparison of a couple other services that are out there. But two, it's actually built much different than anything else on the market. It's the only service that's been built in the last 10 years for ILS. And what makes it different is that it's built on microservices. So we're all very familiar in the last decade with what microservices are. Lots of us have, mobile devices, whether those be Android or iOS or just even the idea about using apps independently of an underlying operating system. We're all very familiar with this in the last decade or so. But FOLIO is the first ILS to do it in this way, to build and architect a system that has that functionality at its core, where applications can be added or removed at will, and it doesn't change any of the underlying business logic of the system. It doesn't change any of the way that items stored in the data well within FOLIO change. Libraries can build new functionality and deploy it into a FOLIO environment. They could go out to a third party, and you could contract with a third party to build new apps and bring it into your ILS. That's the idea with FOLIO, is it gives libraries more choice, more flexibility, and more transparency because it's open source. And APIs, which think of APIs, if you're not very technical, think of APIs as connection points between apps. So APIs are an application programming interface that allow one app to talk to another app, or allow one app to talk to the underlying storage of FOLIO. So the fact that it's all transparent, built on APIs that can all talk to each other and pass data to each other, means that you could build new applications that ILS in the past may not have even used or wanted. Maybe you're an academic research library and you do a ton of research. You fund a lot of research, and there's a research office that has their own CRIS system, their own research integration system, information system, manages the grants that your researchers receive, and then their outputs, right? A lot of tooling goes into that. But maybe you want some data from the research office to come into the ILS. You want to see some of the outputs, not necessarily items that you need to catalog, but maybe it's just papers, preprints, things that might go into a repository. But you want all of that the research office may be tracking, because you want things like, I want a grant ID, or I want grant funding information as it relates to the output. This is one use case where you could bring in data that is atypical for an ILS, build an application, and get it live in FOLIO. So FOLIO is open source, FOLIO is flexible. EBSCO is one of the service vendors that implements, hosts, and supports FOLIO. We have data centers. All of our hosting is done on Amazon Web Services. For the Oceania region, it is hosted out of the AWS Sydney node. And there are many libraries worldwide on EBSCO hosted FOLIO. Many of them are large, a lot of them are medium. But so we work with libraries across all shapes and sizes. I will say that we've been in market now. I think FOLIO has been in market for about 3 years, give or take. And it's done a huge evolution over that time. There's been lots and lots of more and more functionality. There's a brand new customer in this list that we can't announce yet, but they'll be really good to talk about. That's regional, it's in Oceania. They will be a fantastic new EBSCO FOLIO library as well. But there is one customer that is worth announcing. Actually, there's a couple. The National Library of Australia, the NLA, uses FOLIO, EBSCO-hosted FOLIO, as does the Library of Congress. So two big global institutions, global contributors to bibliographic works, bibliographic practices and policies. They're all on EBSCO FOLIO. The two institutions to the right, those are consortia in the US. The Galileo Consortia is 26 academics, and the Mobius Consortia, I want to say it's about 7 or 8. Apologies if I'm miscounting on that. Also academics. The big news for me, and it's not in any way to displace a consortium of academics, there's a lot of big positive news there, is really around the NLA and the Library of Congress. Now, this is really where the linked data piece comes in, is these large national bodies that can modernize libraries, these big institutions with aspirational goals, with funding and resourcing, as well as requirements to keep all of us moving on standards, are these major national systems. So I want to talk about that just a little bit. And that is this FOLIO and BIBFRAME piece. So the Library of Congress recently announced their adoption of FOLIO, EBSCO FOLIO, and part of that adoption was a requirement to support linked data. So they had this open in the tender, and any servicing ILS that was responding must support linked data. This is what I said before around Bibliograph, and that the future direction of descriptive work is linked data. Mark's not going away, but it's definitely linked data. And when the Library of Congress is changing their systems, they want to make sure that the systems support linked data. They also see the future direction as linked data. So one of the things that EBSCO FOLIO libraries will benefit from, I even think it's going to be just FOLIO globally, not just an EBSCO supported at FOLIO, but FOLIO globally, is there will be a relationship between FOLIO and its ability to support linked data. And when I say relationship, I mean at a very technical level, that the underpinning of FOLIO is going to modernize, and that rather than use what we call SRS for record storage, which is source record storage, we're going to be using linked data graphs to store bibliographic records in FOLIO. Now that's huge. Even if you're not technical, that's okay. The ability for an ILS to store linked data graphs as the underpinning for bibliographic description work is an industry first. No other ILS currently support graph data as their underpinning of data within the system. Many of the ILS that do functional areas of linked data will support imports or exports. They may do transformations, but they don't actually store the linked data. Instead, they'll use like XML routines or others that shuffle that data in and out. But keeping it linked data within FOLIO is impactful. Why? Well, one of the reasons is that once the data is transformed into linked data in the graph, that we can then connect a FOLIO environment to authority services directly and have authority enrichment or entity enrichment right into the graph itself. so that anytime I want to create those embeds that you saw, I could go ahead and I could do it directly from FOLIO, from the data storage in FOLIO. Or if I wanted to share data, I mentioned before, sharing from the library to, or sharing from the research office to the library. What if the share was the other way around, where the library shared data out of a FOLIO linked data graph to the research office? So the ability to share data in and out of a graphed environment is really powerful. Now, another thing that a linked data underpinning would require is it would require the ability to edit linked data. It would need a linked data importer, so an RDF importer that can do RDF mapping, and an RDF exporter. And it would need a native linked data editor, not just a MARC editor. And all of those tools are being built for FOLIO as part of the Library Congress requirement. So these things were really, really impactful, in my opinion, in that you have national bodies that can come in and adopt FOLIO, move FOLIO along from functional areas that are required for big, large systems for authority management, original cataloging, et cetera. And then also drive new functional services, with some backing there, and timelines and requirements. And so a lot of those two adoptions for the NLA and the Library of Congress have made FOLIO this really robust service. The first linked data launch we expect to see is actually November this year, which is amazing to me. I hope that timeline, I would say that timeline is not set in stone, but that's when our first hopeful milestone is. And to me, that's fantastic. If we can see that around November, that would be great. If it gets pushed for some delay, that's typical software and services management. That wouldn't surprise me, but that timeline is fantastic. I think we're going to see a lot of modernization, which is what this whole session is about, innovation and direction forward. We're going to see a lot of modernization around how libraries do descriptive work of their bibliographic records and services and systems they use to manage those records. As FOLIO gets these functional areas, we're going to see a lot of libraries look at FOLIO as they themselves want to modernize. So really cool stuff. Okay. Now with all of that, so we've done a lot of good work around the future direction of descriptive work, and then how do we make use of linked data, and even library systems that leverage linked data. So there's lots of cool narratives there, but I also want to talk about analytics, because it's also related to FOLIO. So Panorama. We have had many sessions, webinars, EBSCO's done many sessions around Panorama. Happy, if you haven't heard of it and you're interested after this conversation, happy to continue to having more sessions. Panorama is an analytics service via EBSCO. And what we've done is we've really wanted to leverage and build an analytics service that can do more than just SQL queries and do more than just pivot tables. A lot of what we see in analytics tools today are, I'll say, dated. I'm particularly talking about library-specific analytics products. A lot of times this is why institutions will try to leverage their BI departments, right? Their institutional data or analytics departments. They'll send data around the catalog. They'll send data from acquisitions to this department, and they'll get better analytics because the library themselves haven't had robust analytics tools. At most, we've had SQL queries into like OBI or something of that like. So we wanted to build a modern analytics service. And that's really where we looked at the landscape to get some assessment of, is our thinking right? Is our desire to build this robust analytics tool, is that also in line with how librarians feel? Well, the Library Journal put out a survey, and it seems like not only are there big barriers of entry, but there's still a big desire to have analytics tools be supportive of what they need, like not only from acquisitions and curation of collection and all that, but to show the impact of their institution, of the library, within their institution. So I want to look, let's say I'm doing a libraries analytics project, and I want to look at, does the library impact the mission of the institution with, say, student engagement or outcomes? That is a core narrative to library value in an academic setting. Am I providing benefit to the students to make them more successful on campus? And what we would get from an analytics standpoint is the projects are difficult to do. The projects themselves often are finite in scope, so they may run and then end. They often require approval around budgets or extra resources to do themselves, whether those are human resources or systems or services. So they were really difficult. And yeah, we all know that they're really valuable. So how do we build? So EBSCO, then we said we had this desire, and we got validation looking at a lot of the survey results. And yet we still have these dashboards that don't really help us much. So we said, okay, well, let's build an environment where we use modern BI front ends, a UI that is very modern, user interface that's very modern. So we're using Tableau as a front end. EBSCO has a white label license with Tableau to build that on the front end to make it really easy to use the data underneath it. Now, underneath it, the data itself is stored in Amazon Web Services. We're already familiar with this, not only for EBSCO FOLIO environments, but we're familiar with it for Bibliograph and other EBSCO services as to deploy in AWS. This also conforms to Australia and New Zealand's data sovereignty regulations by hosting out of Sydney. So we can deploy an environment, a data environment that's scalable, so we can continue to add more and more data sources or historical data if we wanted. And we put a BI tool front end that is very easy to use and slice that data. Great. Now we have kind of the functional areas, the foundation, if you will, of what a modern library analytics tool would look like. What kind of data can we put in, and how can we make sure that that data itself is accessible and extensible for libraries? Those are the next hurdles. So not only is everything that you see in Tableau, real time as much as we can get them, the data feeds themselves to the different data sources at a library are often APIs. We don't want to be pushing one data set in a spreadsheet, load it into Amazon Web Services, do data mapping, and then load it into Tableau. That's not what we would prefer. We want to connect a system for a library to our underlying Panorama data store, and then have the data on demand, real time, as often as possible. So that's number one. We need to make sure that data is live as often as possible. Two, we want to actually make sure it's not just library systems. Yes, it's valuable to have all of the standard reporting that libraries need. We need circulation data. We need things like check-in and check-out, topical things around what's the most used title or what's the subject areas that we really need. But I also need data around non-catalog data. So my authentication tools, Proxy, cool. Open Athens and SAML, cool, that's fine. Of course, I want my counter statistics. So whether I'm connecting data to JUSP, or if I'm connecting out of EBSCO's usage consolidation service, some way I want to get my electronic resources stats, my counter stats. So I want to pull all of those in. There's also a lot more. Chat services, my learning management services, my course reserve services. Maybe I want to really make sure that my student services, which maybe that's Oracle or Banner or PeopleSoft or Studiosity, maybe I want to make sure those ERP tools can also come in so that I know who my students are and what their grades might be. And then I could correlate grades and GPA to things like how often do they sign in or check items out at the library. So I can make some causal potential correlations to data about how effective then is the library in outcomes of students overall? And of course, I want all of that data to be easy to use and leverage and work with and filter and sort and then export, et cetera. So a lot of this has already been built into Panorama. You can see lots of different data sources here. The really good news is that we continue to expand this. To date, there's something around 40 data sources connected to Panorama, everything from ILS and authentication to link resolver services to browser plugins like Third Iron's libkey, to again, proxy and repositories and archives, all of that kind of stuff we want to bring in and connect to Panorama. The more analytics you can make centralized, the more often you will be able to leverage that data in a functional way, rather than having to guess as to, yeah, my repository has been used a lot over the last quarter. We would have data to back up contributions to a repository, accesses to a repository, et cetera. There's also some, there's a couple before I get into the cool stuff at the end. There's a couple just real basic traditional reports here we're gonna show you. So circulation stats, physical collection circulation stats. You can see obviously the number of loans, and I get to see previous loans from the year prior. I can see that here. So the gray bar is previous year, and this is the current year out of our filter dates. I can see even by different loan locations. So current year versus previous year, different subject areas, top borrowed titles. That's not a surprise to see some of these functional items here that for, when people come in and check out while they're on location. Here's a chat service. So I think this is a library help chat service. So this is a board. And I can see who's operating efficiently. This one here, stands out as an anomaly. How come operator 1 has such a low chat duration? It's because this is actually a redirector. It will direct the inquiry into somebody else in a more functional, specific chat discussion. But these types of insights are quick and easy access for me. And discovery boards, I can see databases and again, year-over-year comparisons of usage by subject area, maybe not database specific, but subject, or by publisher specific. So lots of different dashboards that cover lots of different systems to give you insights right away. Now, one of the areas that is the newest for us in Panorama is the transformative agreements in a read and publish dashboard. We actually have 2 different read and publish dashboards in Panorama. One of them is focused on publisher data. And that's what this board is here. I can see the different open access models, whether they were green, gold, bronze, or potentially behind a closed issue down here. And I can see who within a contributing author versus the actual publishing author and a corresponding. I can see where we are as an institutional output across different publishers by their open access model. So where are we principally contributing to? And then the average time cited and average estimated APC charge costing. So some pretty good insights at a publisher level into whether or not this APC model for, say, a particular publisher needs amending or makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'm looking at, in this case, Springer Nature, and I can see that we do a lot of gold open access publishing with Springer here. And maybe the next time I work with Elsevier, I want to have more gold. And so that becomes part of my discussion as we look at that transformative agreement with Elsevier. But I can look at this at a high level and get some quick summaries or narratives on our outputs with that publisher. Now, the next board on the read and publish is around the agreements themselves from a costing standpoint. So here I can look at an average publisher cost and an average read cost by the different publishers, how many articles, and average metrics that are driven by cost models that we've input. So these data points here allow me to identify, say, some standout areas that are great on maybe real average publishing costs. So down here, we're publishing a lot to them, and the average costing is within our scope as an institution, perhaps. Maybe some of these other ones we're really not publishing to, and so our cost models are pretty high. Or I could come in, I could look at the agreements themselves and just look for outliers across average cost grids of publishing cost versus read costs. So we've tried to use different visuals to give libraries insights into their transformative agreements themselves, how they have outputs and advocate internally. So how do I enable my faculty and let them know, it's probably in your interest to publish open access from a citation standpoint. That would be this down here. And I could look at average time cited. I could see that, those that are closed don't get cited very frequently, but those that are open access green, so all access, get cited the most. So I could go and talk with faculty about how do they publish matters on citations, which really matter to faculty. Or if I wanted to talk around agreement efficiency, as I'm working with publishers on a new agreement, I could look at agreement efficiency. It's important to note as well, there are other read, report, and publish dashboards that exist, have been created. And this how this differs a little bit is not just in what you're seeing on the visualizations, but in where the data is from. This is a amalgamation of data, just like you saw with the previous dashboards, where we can create lots of different data points by connecting multiple systems and create some cross narratives of data. This is similarly data from multiple sources to create a cross narrative. Some of this data comes from the institutions themselves, whether it's an export from a research office or a live feed from a research office, or if it's from the library, sometimes the library does monitor and manage their transformative agreement processes. Sometimes they don't, sometimes it sits in the research office. So depending upon who owns some of that data around faculty, their cost models of their agreement, who their agreements are with, some of the data is EBSCO data because we have relationships with publishers. So it's proprietary EBSCO data. We know data around, say, article read usage from counter statistics, or even citation details we may know. So there's elements of this that are put together in a way that we think is really empowering to libraries as they assess their open access footprints. So really fun stuff, totally new from EBSCO. These are new in, say, the last 60 days, probably, these read and publish dashboards. The Panorama service as a whole, to have all of those different data sources, is not 60 days. They are probably 15 months, 18 months now old. So Panorama as a service has been around for a little bit. If you are looking for a robust analytics tool that is not just one system output that you need to then do your own comparisons of analytics, I highly recommend having a discussion about whether or not Panorama has the data sources connected that you're interested in, or it's possible to connect the ones that you're interested in. Happy to have those discussions. And then I also think, again, the whole topic about innovation is really looking at linked data and how libraries do bibliographic description work, linked data moving forward, and manage services that are in the open source domain to empower their linked data sharing, like FOLIO. Any questions? Okay, well, I don't see any questions in the Q&A. Oh, I see one question now. Does FOLIO still? Yes, FOLIO definitely supports MARC 100%. So FOLIO will continue to support MARC. MARC is not going away, not anytime soon, at least. FOLIO will continue to support MARC, MARC 21, MARC XML, et cetera. But FOLIO was obviously going to do transformations of that MARC into BIBFRAME so that it will support linked data as well. Good question. Yes, must support MARC today. Also support, so the RDF importer that is going to launch with the linked data support. The RDF importer will import records of all schemas. So whether that's Dublin Core, EAD, whatever that looks like, RDF is schema agnostic. Yep. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks everybody for attending. Again, the recording will be wrapped up and shared from Alia. Thank you, Alia, for hosting. I appreciate all of the support of Alia. We obviously want to continue to support Alia directly as well. And I hope you all have a great day. Thanks much.